It's great to be with you all today. Hi, everybody. I know many of you on the screen, so it's great to see everybody. So today we are going to be talking about food innovation and hopefully start to build on some of the capabilities that Catherine just referenced about what's happening here in Rhode Island in the innovation space relative to food and one of our competitive strengths, as Janet mentioned. And hopefully everyone will leave this particular session and say, wow, I didn't realize that. And perhaps think further and more in depth about what Rhode Island can do to distinguish itself as truly the food capital of the world, if we're not already the food capital of the world, in any event. So my job is simply to keep the conversation moving. And we have three distinguished panelists and a number of questions that we want to pose to them. So the idea is to have a fast-moving session. So we'll start with the intros simply, and after we do that fairly quickly, we'll get into some very specific questions about what we're seeing here, strengths, weaknesses, obstacles, ways that we can move forward together. So I will ask each of the panelists to very quickly introduce themselves, what their role is within their institution, and what brought them here to Rhode Island. So let's do this fairly quickly, and let me start with Julie.
Great. Thanks, Laurie. I figured I'd go first. I was like, she's going to call on me. So really glad to be here. Nice to meet everyone. I am about 2 months into my new role as the Director of Food Strategy for the state. I am the second to fill this position, and I have big shoes to fill. Everyone has so many wonderful things to say about my predecessor, Sue, who I've had the opportunity to meet. So I'm very new, and I hope I have just as much to learn as I do to share today. And you know, maybe we'll have another opportunity to kind of chat in a few months, and you can ask me then like how my perspective has changed. But so my background is more recently in farm to institution, but I've worked for 15 years in all different parts of the food system. I started working on farms as a small scale, vegetable farmer. I worked at farmers markets, and then I moved to Italy to be a chef. So I was doing private chefing. I started a cooking school there. And then I moved back to the States and got more involved in schools and institutions. So my last role was at Boston College, where I helped to build a regional and sustainable food procurement program for campus dining services. And through that work, I got involved with a lot of the New England players that are working towards the New England Food Vision, which envisions that 50% of the food that we consume as New Englanders will be grown, produced, and processed here in the New England region by 2060. So I'm really I guess I come to this work from that kind of institutional perspective. I know, and I've been really impressed. All I can say is in the 60 days, I think I've met over 100 different people, many of you on the call and some of you not. So I'm just really happy to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Julie. So you will no doubt, your network will grow exponentially even after today's session. So now let's go to Patrick, and let's hear from you, Patrick.
Well, welcome. Thank you for having me. So I'm also fairly new to Rhode Island and to University of Rhode Island, where I'm an assistant professor of food systems policy and innovation. And I came to Rhode Island, I come to URI from California. I was at University of California, Berkeley. I came up through environmental science, policy, and management. And I worked closely with the Berkeley Food Institute there and the Center for Diversified Farming Systems. And I sort of see my role as in higher education as twofold, as you might imagine. There's research and there's education. And on the research end of things, I really focus and zoom in on that interface between policy and practice within food systems. And I've worked primarily with, row crop farming systems and so forth, topics related to food safety, related to diversification and conservation of natural resources and so forth, and how that intersects with policy. But I really kind of bring a sort of social ecological systems lens to that. And on the educational side, when we're talking about innovation and so forth, the thing that I keep coming back to is the idea that given the suite of all sorts of social and economic and political and environmental challenges that food systems, including right here in Rhode Island, are facing moving forward, the one resource that we have in abundance, right, that's totally renewable and sort of limitless is human ingenuity. And I think that really does start with, educating the next generation, building skills, building that human capital. So, we've got a sustainable agriculture and food systems major and graduate program at University of Rhode Island, which I'm involved with, in addition to the sort of suite of classic agri-food science and nutrition studies programs. So I think, really excited about the potential to build that all together through that systems framework to really kind of support innovation from that human development, human capital development perspective via education.
Thank you very much, Patrick. We'll now flip to another one of our premier institutional partners, and Jason from Johnson & Wales. And we know that Johnson & Wales probably is pretty much responsible for really setting the food scene on fire. And it goes back many decades and many generations. So Jason, hello. And you also are new to Rhode Island. So I'm seeing a trend here among our three panelists. They've all been drawn to Rhode Island because of our reputation. So that says something in and of itself. So how are you doing today, Jason?
Good, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. So I'm Jason Evans, and I've been in Rhode Island since the first week of January. I'm actually coming off of 12 years in upstate New York as a professor in agribusiness and agricultural economics, where my focus really was on regional food systems, agricultural and food policy. And I was presented with the opportunity to build on my academic and administrative experience in New York at Johnson & Wales as Dean of the College of Food Innovation and Technology. So my most important job at this point is to transition Johnson & Wales from being seen really primarily as a culinary school or a culinary college to one that's much more broadly focused in all things food. And so that means expanding our academic program offerings. It means expanding the way our students are interacting with food entrepreneurs, the services that we provide to food entrepreneurs. So really making us what we are in the eyes of the country and the world as a premier institution for the culinary arts, really transitioning that to being a premier institution in all things food. I'm living right in downtown Providence, so I'm a country boy, grew up on a farm in West Virginia, lived in very, very rural upstate New York. So I've enjoyed this transition and see so many opportunities for what food systems can and should be in these more urban environments. So I'm very pleased to be with you.
So we have at least two of our panelists who have real experience getting down in the dirt on the farm expressly in Julie and Jason. Hey, Patrick, did you spend any time yourself on a farm in the dirt?
No, actually, like I said, I came from more the environmental science and policy side of things. So I come into food systems from that angle rather than from the actual farming angle.
So let's talk about some of the trends that we're seeing. And again, this particular panel is focused on stimulating ideas and thoughts and setting off a light bulb, if you will, among the food entrepreneurs that are listening, who are thinking about what's coming up down the road and looking for ideas for ways to position their businesses to take advantage of this explosion in food innovation. So with that in mind, and with that as a backdrop for our discussion today and as our theme, let me go around the horn and ask each of you to tell us what you think the most impactful or idea generated trend that you are seeing in food innovation today that might help our listeners and viewers come up with an idea on their own that they can run off with. So let me start once again with Julie.
Well, I don't know if I can just pick one, but I can tell you some things that I'm really inspired by, that I'm really hopeful for. And I guess I think about, I come from the food systems perspective, and I think about things, I guess, at different levels. So at a more broad level, there's a total shift in culture happening right now, or I don't know, attitude maybe. And I think a lot of it is coming from this new administration. And I think a lot of it is coming from the pandemic and people just kind of having to just stop in their shoes and have to kind of rethink the way we're doing things and have to face a lot of the challenges head on. So I guess that to me is something that I think is exciting and that entrepreneurs and food businesses can think about, right? Is that like new perspective. And the fact, the three of us on this call all talked about, what we see URI has already been doing and what CFIT and Dean Evans is doing. It's that systems thinking, right? That and that's a theme that I'm hearing too in the previous conversations, right? So that's really exciting to me that we're starting to say, wait, well, I can help you and you can help me. And maybe we have different values or different ways of doing things, but we want to get to the same place. So that's a trend that I'm seeing both in Rhode Island, in New England, but also at a national level as well. So that's exciting. Other cool things are like plant-based, no surprise there, but that is rapidly growing. I have my own, I'd love to hear, I don't know, maybe this is for a separate conversation. I have hesitations around like some of the cellular agriculture and alternative meats versus just like beans and legumes. So that's kind of interesting to me, thinking about from like a sustainability perspective and a health perspective as well. And then regenerative agriculture is a term that I feel like popped up and is everywhere now. And that's exciting to me because it goes beyond just sustainability and saying, well, let's stop doing harm, but it goes to this kind of like healing and recuperation and thinking of food systems and agriculture and the way we eat as an opportunity actually to heal systems and make the world better. So that's interesting to me. And then like in Rhode Island, I think there's some amazing, we just heard this morning, right? But there's so many cool things happening around urban agriculture, aquaculture, thinking about underutilized seafood and species, which Jason and I have talked about, farm to institution, hydroponics. I just learned yesterday about RI Grows and farmer Tim Shartner in Exeter building a hydroponic greenhouse. So there's so many cool things. And I'm so new, I'm still learning, but I think if food innovators and entrepreneurs, I guess, can like plug into that existing system, they'll succeed.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Given your role, Julie, at Commerce RI, truly your thinking is around how to take these assets and turn them into economic development and ways that we can grow the economy truly with specific ways and specific businesses and opportunities in creating jobs. So of all the trends that you just identified, which were really fascinating, particularly the regenerative agriculture, which of those do you think has real potential to create jobs?
So I think the indoor growing is pretty interesting, and I'm just kind of learning right now all the different pieces of that are already happening. But I think Ken Ayers, the chief of agriculture, was quoted saying Rhode Island can be the next Netherlands. Netherlands is this tiny country that's in Northern Europe that is the second largest exporter of food, the agriculture exporter by value in the world. The first is the United States. So, we just have to kind of change our way of thinking and possibilities. We're not going to compete with California in terms of year-round food production, right? So I think there's lots of examples of innovation vouchers, speaking from Commerce's perspective, that are trying to kind of support those kinds of research and innovation and possibilities. Patrick, maybe you can speak, or maybe you will speak later. I'm still learning about the Ag Tech campus that's going to be opening at URI, which is going to be researching and having kind of like a hub and a space for building that capacity of like the workforce and research. And so I'm still learning about that, but that's really exciting. And I know that Commerce was part of funding that. So so that's one. There's many, but I think that is one in particular that is really exciting in Rhode Island.
Patrick, with that as a preface, over to you to give us your thoughts on what do you see as the key trends in food innovation today that we can capitalize on?
Yeah, tough to follow on Julie's excellent list there. Yeah, I mean, I think we're at this inflection point, right? And Julie had mentioned this. Coming off of this pandemic, there's this opportunity for many aspects of the way that we're organized, right? And food is all about how we're organized as a society, right? How we produce food and get it to people and eat it. And people are at this moment of just really thinking about that and paying attention to it. And there's some opportunities there. And one that I'll bring up that I don't think has quite come out as much, but which I think actually has a lot of potential to connect a bunch of dots for folks. And that I do think is sort of an entrepreneurial, opportunity front in a way is around this concept of food justice and equity. And food is, again, sort of like a vehicle to get toward justice and greater equity in our societies and rethinking the way that these food systems work. We see a much greater attention to, not just representation, but also things like dignified livelihoods and so forth. And we know that so many people are employed in all aspects of food systems that, with COVID, we've seen are deemed essential, but which maybe haven't been recognized and valued in the same way in society. And I think there's an opportunity for some really rethinking and some innovation in terms of the kind of business models that are out there for different sorts of food operations to bring this idea of not just jobs, but livelihoods, right? That are supporting people in a dignified way, that are building community economic vitality, and that are really leading to greater human connection. And that's really, I think, this thing that people are craving right now. Been craving for a long time, but COVID kind of brought it to a head, right? The idea that we're connected to other people and that we have a sense of shared identity and community and so forth. And food can help be a vehicle to build that. And I think this idea of justice and equity and this idea of dignified livelihoods is a way to kind of get there. So ways to work that into business models, I think, is going to be a big deal moving forward right now.
That's a really cool idea or a concept or theory around post-COVID and the desire for connectivity between and among people, and then using food as the basis for that, which is very much an ancient tradition and civilization, right, Patrick?
Yeah, it's maybe more of an aspirational vision, but it's also an opportunity to come out there and say, let's have some vision. Let's see if we can do some bold new things, and definitely some opportunities right here in food.
Jason, from your perspective, what are you seeing as some of the major trends in the food innovation ecosystem that we can build on here in Rhode Island?
Sure. I think it's increasingly that people with their food dollars are buying so much more than food. So it's this increase in values-based buying where people's food choices reflect how they feel about ecological priorities, how they feel about society, how they feel about waste and issues around mitigating it. And so I think these entrepreneurs that are able to capture these values in really sophisticated, innovative products are kind of ruling the day right now in all of these food sectors. So the challenge, though, for me is how to make those opportunities, which of course you can only take advantage of with fairly sophisticated product development, fairly sophisticated food science and packaging science, how to make sure that those opportunities are not just the purview of the big boys, how those opportunities become realities to mid and small scale food producers and processors. And that is going to take collaboration among institutions of higher education to somehow provide those types of services to small companies, and certainly the chamber and other nonprofit organizations. But we're also missing some small middle scale infrastructure in processing and distribution. So the trend, I think, for me, that is probably rife with opportunity is values-based buying in the food sector. But the challenge is translating that into being triggerable opportunities for small and medium scale companies.
Thank you, Jason. So you mentioned what some of these things need to do to become realities. And I would suggest that the first thing that needs to happen before any of these concepts becomes reality is to really excite the consumer, if you will, awareness, desire, interest, that whole funnel there. So what is the role of the consumer, to your point, Jason, and I invite anybody else to jump in as they see fit, but what do we need to do as a society to get the consumer really dialed into these alternative food ideas?
This is really tough because even though I'm saying that the trend here really is values-based buying, food provenance and buying from a farm or a food manufacturer who is contributing to a local economy, who is really part of their community, buying local, buying regional, even though it figures into some consumers' value assessment when they're making food choices, doesn't happen for the masses. And so the consumer, when they, as I always say, and Julie and I had this talk a couple of weeks ago, the problem is that when the consumer walks into the grocery store and buys these products from very large manufacturers, global manufacturers, produce growers in California and Central America, they're finding really high quality product at very reasonable prices. It's all very safe and it's all in the same place. So that provenance value system is competing with this really super convenient status quo, right? I care about certain things, and so I can buy a granola bar that uses food waste and I feel really good about myself. But how do you get that to translate into thinking about the impact of the food system on your local communities and local opportunities and economies in those communities, I think is a big leap because of how good the status quo is perceived to be. So I answered your question with really more of another challenge.
Patrick, your thoughts about the challenge that Jason outlined of, how to really
Yeah, I mean,
get away from the notion of convenience, easy way out.
Yeah, I think it was what Michael Pollan, what now 15 years ago, something like that, came out with the whole idea of, voting with your fork as a food consumer. And so for me, one of the big challenges is to get folks, the masses, as Jason put it, not thinking just as consumers, not thinking just as, the hand that holds the pocketbook, but thinking as citizens, right? Thinking as community members, acting as, members of a broader social web that has, market transactions and these economic relationships, but also has other kinds of relationships beyond just that. And I think, again, that goes back to that point about this craving for some human connection. And that's the kind of thing that the sort of values-based economy that Jason was, sort of pointing out, like there's this opportunity for that. That's the kind of thing that can offer, that is the one thing that people aren't able to find most of the time at that one-stop shop grocery store that's, bringing in, bell peppers from the Netherlands and, hothouse tomatoes from Quebec or something like that. They're able to tap into that story, that sense of community and so forth. And I think in terms of the challenges, what Jason was saying before is exactly right. There's an opportunity, there's a demand from the consumer side. And I think that that's there, that's nascent. And even with the masses, I think that we're not that far off. I think people are like really primed to buy into this if they can get access to it. And there's a lot of, groundswell in especially younger folks, people who are really out there, they want to entrepreneur, they want to get into that space. There was a mention earlier that on any given year, Rhode Island sees 1,000 new restaurants, right, come into existence, and we lose 1,000 as well. So, but we see the same thing with farms, urban farms, community gardens, small scale market farms that people are trying to start up in their backyard. There's plenty of that activity there. So we got activity and potential on the consumption end, activity and potential on the supply end, or at least on the production end. And it's like, well, why aren't these things coming together, right? Like everything's there. And it's that infrastructure in the middle that Jason's talking about. And some of that's physical infrastructure, I agree. But some of that is other kind of infrastructure, the sort of soft social infrastructure. And we see this debate playing out right now on the national stage, right, over what this definition of infrastructure is. And I think there's definitely some merit, and we can see it right here in Rhode Island, to this idea that you need to think beyond just roads and warehouses and so forth, but you need to think about, you know, how do we actually have spaces where people can come together and meet a farmer, meet, you know, a small scale cottage industry person producing jams and butters and things like that. How do we have the kind of digital online infrastructure that's creating opportunities for people to connect, you know, with the smartphone that everybody has? You know, these sorts of things, and how to make it possible, you know, how to help people bridge the gap between being like part-time and being full-time in different sorts of ways as you try to get your business up to full economic viability. A lot that needs to be done in that middle space.
How about linking it, I'm wondering, to the notion of climate change, and everybody is very animated around climate change and farming and food production, traditional food production, very much, you know, certain aspects of that tied to reducing CO2 emissions. So Julie, any thoughts on that, or Patrick or Jason from the academic perspective? They're all about, you know, this piece of the conversation started about how to get consumers to be more aware and to be more responsive, and to, you know, look beyond the convenience of what they are usually accustomed to, and think about it in a different way. So I guess my question is the whole movement around climate change, is that something that has any kind of traction?
It could. I mean, the truth is consumers are primarily responsive to one thing, and that's prices. And so if technology continues to develop such that we're able to produce foods, fresh foods, in the Northeast, in controlled environment agriculture situations indoors, at a price point that is competitive with what is now coming out of our national system, Southern California, Mexico, and otherwise, then now we've got a ball game. But we also, though, have to always keep in mind that there are, in fact, carbon footprints and ecological damage potentially from those indoor sort of northeastern production systems, because they're incredibly energy intensive. So I think that there's still some science and tech and development work that needs to happen before that system is not only price competitive on the end product, but around which we can also build an entirely compelling story to say, if you take food miles into account, energy use into account, overall, the carbon footprint of this food is lower than the food you were eating. I do think that can be a compelling part of the story, but there's some science to still happen there.
It sounds like an entrepreneurial problem.
No question about it. Absolutely.
Folks listening to that comment, Jason, could say, hey, you know, I understand, you know, the whole notion of vertical farming creates a problem in and of itself with energy usage and energy consumption. So how, you know, is there a business idea there? Julie, you know, thoughts around, other thoughts around getting the consumer to think of these whole systems in a fresher way?
Yeah, I mean, so it's spot on, right? Like convenience and price matter, but so does taste and pleasure. And that's where I think chefs come in a big way. And I saw it, you know, when I worked at in BC and in the culinary world, you have a white jacket on and people listen to you. So I think we have to lead with taste as well, and pleasure and joy and connection. And I really, what you said, Patrick, really resonates with me, because you know, thinking about ourselves as not passive consumers, but active citizens, right? That food citizens perspective means that, you know, maybe you think about like the $1,000 iPhone versus like the $4 a pound tomatoes. And I get it. Not everyone has that choice. That's a privilege, and that is an issue, but it's connected, right? Like a lot of the low wage jobs that we see are in the food sector, right? So it's like this chicken or the egg piece. And speaking about, you know, Jason and I had talked about that, like the subsidies piece, right? Like the giant in the room is that we're competing with a legacy of heavily subsidized commodity food products, So when we think about from an investment perspective as a state or as commerce, or thinking about our food strategy, right, which Relish Rhode 2017 laid out, we have to think as a state about what kind of world we want and how we're investing in that system. And I can give lots of examples, right? Like the innovation voucher is one great example. The LASA program, right? The Local Agriculture and Seafood Act does seed funding at $20,000. I think this year there's maybe $150,000 or $200,000 that's going to go out to small scale, new and beginning farmers. We have to think about land access, right? So the Department of Environmental Management, which is one of the agencies I work with, they have this amazing program where they actually lease out land for like $1 an acre or something like that. So Southside Community Land Trust and Snake Den Farm. So these things are happening, but we can't think we're gonna compete with big ag. We have to prioritize and subsidize and invest in this system that really hasn't had the subsidies that like commodity products are having in California and Florida. So
Avi, who is listening, when you said that, Julie, wrote into the chat bingo when you talked about big ag and the subsidies around that. And that really is national policy. It's all tied into, you know, political representation in Congress, large states, budget driven federal budgets that in fact provide these subsidies. So
right.
a very complicated equation there around you know, larger states, larger populations, and electability of their own representatives, senators and representatives, and how that, you know, can filter through. So strikes me as a very important element of what we're discussing, and also another challenging, you know, talking about challenges, right? That sounds like that's something that really is a stubborn challenge. So reaction to that, Patrick or Jason?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind jumping in there because I think, you know, what Julie was saying was exactly spot on. And there's two things, right, that that Rhode Island and that, you know, sort of New England, if we think about it as like a regional food system, can do and can provide in terms of our food production that like the really big commodity agriculture can't do. And the first is quality. I mean, I don't care how you look at it, the quality of lettuce that you're going to get from California is not going to be the same as the quality of lettuce that you're going to get from a local producer. It doesn't do well traveling across the country. And there's all sorts of really high technology that's come online, the whole cold chain and everything like that. It gets it here, it's pretty good. But at the end of the day, right, you're going to be able to do a lot more with, so there's that whole quality aspect. But the other thing that I want to come back to, and this is really what sort of COVID has, I think, really made people aware of, you know, is like COVID came in and one of the first things that happened is you couldn't buy seeds, right? Everybody was rushing to start up home gardens and whatever. Anybody who had some land was out there doing food production. And it's because people all of a sudden realized they're like, oh, wait, you know, what if, you know, the Stop and Shop or the Safeway or whatever, what if those shelves are bare? What am I going to do? You know what I mean? And they looked at, and people are looking at this food system that we have and saying, oh my gosh, if a ship gets stuck in the middle of the Suez Canal, right? What if the whole thing grinds to a halt? And we've gotten to this point with these subsidies, with the massive industrialization of our big food commodity groups, where we have a really, really efficient system. We get those really low prices that Jason was talking about, and it's convenient and accessible. But what we don't have is a resilient system, because we don't have redundancy and we don't have like the ability to have local reliability on our local systems. And, you know, I come from social ecological system stuff. And so if we think about lessons that we learned from ecology, right? What makes an ecosystem resilient is in part redundancy, having multiple species in an ecosystem that fulfills some of the same functions. So if something comes in and knocks one out, you've got backups that can step in and fill up the system, right? And so that's where having a more distributed and locally based system, you've got some more opportunity, you got some more flexibility, you got some greater potential for adaptation. And I think selling those points at the state level through policy, selling that to people, consumers, in terms of entrepreneurial marketing and so forth, is going to be an opportunity as well. That idea that we also have resilience in the face of some scary things that are happening in the world at large, right? And people want to kind of be a little bit more safe and secure in the face of it as well. Here's an opportunity and a means to do that as well. And I just want to like provide a +1 for Julie's point about land access. You know, at the end of the day, all food production comes back down to natural resources and functioning ecosystems, right? So if you don't have land, right, or if you don't have access to your marine-based resources, we're not going to be able to really get production to where it could be. So I think that's a huge elephant in the room as well, especially in places like Southern New England. We have some of the highest land values around, and that's a real barrier.
We have 9 minutes left in our discussion, and I just want to throw out a couple of other topics that consumers may be wrestling with that they might be aware of, and how the food innovation ecosystem can address these. Of course, none of us could ever have imagined that the Suez Canal would be shut down, you know, being blocked by a big ship, or that the Stop and Shop would be running out of food, and you know, things like that. But on top of that, we see like crazy things like lettuce. You mentioned lettuce being contaminated by E. coli. And then we, you know, Julie, you talked about regenerative agriculture and fishing, and some of the consumer publications talking about these tactics and these other, you know, sources of fish that you might want to buy as like garbage fish. So there's a sense of, you know, is the consumer a little nervous, if you don't mind me asking, about are they nervous about buying food that is part of big ag? Are they more comfortable, you know, local, or is it the other way around in terms of consumer acceptance?
I think that's tough to answer in the aggregate, but what's important, I think, is that at least consumers in the last year have thought more about food than they have the mass consumer because of COVID and those supply disruptions. And it's not just easy anymore to walk into the restaurant and get what I need. I mean, just the transition in food away from home to food cooked at home was stunning. And it was driven by mandate, right? You have to eat at home or have somehow food delivered to you. So I think the most important part of your question is that at least consumers are thinking. So if there was a time to strike, it is now. I do think we are in a different position than we were 2 years ago, but it will take private investment. I mean, private investors and those monies are going to have to find the food system to build out this virtual and physical infrastructure that we need to really have a reimagined food system. So the money has to come into the equation, and I do think that's shaking loose as well, that the investment community is seeing food and beverage a little differently, even agriculture differently than they used to as an investment mechanism.
And so speaking of that, I've been reading about how there's talk that the Biden administration wants to pay farmers to grow regeneratively. So there's also a lot of public investment that's potentially coming in, and interesting models like that, where like, how do you incentivize a farmer to transition to organic or regenerative, right? Which we know captures carbon, sequesters carbon. So there's really cool, I think it's a really exciting time. And I'd rather underutilize instead of garbage. No one likes to eat garbage fish. That's a term.
But I saw it
underloved, I've heard too, underloved fish.
Well, the point is, I saw it on the front cover of a magazine.
Oh, you did? Oh gosh.
At the top, you know, I think I have it right over there on the table. I could go run and get it, but then I would be leaving my station here. But
I can give you a specific example though, Laurie, of like how shifting consumers, because I was working in the higher ed space before, and I did a lot of like food literacy and education with students, and we were able to switch our cod to an underutilized species no one had heard of. It was called Acadian redfish. No one knew about it, but the students didn't care. They just cared that it was like flaky, buttery, and fried, and with like some aioli and cabbage, and they loved it. And we did Taco Tuesday. So that's what I'm saying. Like, you have to just make it taste good and obviously be affordable and accessible. But the consumers are active in this process. So.
Well, I know Ken Levy, formerly of Johnson & Wales University, is on this call, and I remember the chamber in Johnson & Wales many years ago, I want to say like maybe 8 or 9, Ken. We did a whole summit on underutilized fish, and Johnson & Wales chefs being part of the teaching mechanism of saying, okay, well, how do you take an underutilized fish and dress it up with aioli and make it really good? So I didn't mean to detour like that. Okay, so we have 4 minutes left, and in the 4 minutes, let's bring it back here sort of in a lightning round fashion. And since we have so many policymakers here and listening and entrepreneurs, let's just quickly answer the question. What is the one thing that we see as a challenge here in Rhode Island in the ecosystem that we could potentially identify sooner rather than later and offer up a quick fix that would have long-term benefits? So very quickly, what is a challenge that we want to raise today that we can think about how to, really, nail that going forward? So let me start with Jason this time.
Well, all I've said is challenges, so it's hard for me to isolate that. In lightning round fashion, let's move beyond the consumer and say that our challenge here in the Northeast is in fact seasonality. And so that means you do have to have technology and innovation around the way you're producing food, certainly when we're talking about fresh food. So seasonality, and related to that is the innovation and development that has to happen to actually be able to grow food here. Produce food here in a way that is competitive with what consumers expect. I will say though that what I tried to get in was that we do have a great start in Rhode Island with, at the executive branch level, having a position like Julie's that is unifocused on food systems. That is rare across the country, and so it's a great starting point for bringing all the right players to the table.
Patrick, you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah. So, there's been some talk about, the indoor growing, vertical growing, whatever it might be. But I also do want to point out that we have a long way that we could go as well in terms of outdoor, in the dirt, standard, classic farming. We've got we need the high-tech solutions, but we've also got a lot of low-tech solutions that, instead of being sort of like capital or like technology intensive, are knowledge and skill intensive and experience intensive. And there's a lot of potential there that we could build on. My colleague, John Taylor here at URI, has done some amazing things with our agroecological farming, showing just how much food you can produce on a standard city lot, for example, if you really have, come into it with a skill-based perspective. But the big barrier that we're facing there, and I said it before, I'm gonna want to say it again, is land. Getting people access to land so they get started up. We see parcels that are in the dozens to hundreds of acres that are available for sale. Maybe they're really expensive. When you think about the size acreage that a beginning farmer needs, you're talking about a couple acres, right? So we've got a fundamental mismatch there that we need to deal with in terms of how to get people access to the right amount of acreage at the right price that they can get a business started in the first place. Because once they get going, I think there's a really high potential that just standard farms can be viable. They just got to get past that startup cost. It comes down to land.
Julie, would you like to have the last word and wrap us up?
Sure, it's really hard to pick one, but I guess I would say transparency. I think that a space that entrepreneurs can help is with creating more transparency in the supply chain. I think a lot of the reason we got into these problems in the first place is because the consumer is so far away from understanding any sense of how food is grown. And I think if they start to understand the pieces of that value chain and the people involved in it, I think that we'll start to see a rapid shift in the way that people eat. So transparency would be my answer.
Well, thank you very much, Julie and Patrick and Jason. This has been fantastic. And we are concluding right on schedule. I'd like to thank Toonie and Catherine and Al and Amy and Janet and everybody that played such an important role in putting this program together. And Lots of you mentioned innovation vouchers, and I know Christine Smith from Commerce RI is also listening very intently, and the innovation voucher program has a strong role to play in continuing to stimulate entrepreneurial activity here in Rhode Island, and also the growth of new businesses, companies, industries, and jobs. So with that, Amy, I will turn it back to you, and thank you for allowing the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce to be part of this discussion today.